Okay, now I don't know if you're familiar with justification, sanctification, glorification. This is Wesleyan terminology. To be clear, it doesn't normally show up in the non-Methodist tradition, even though Wesley, of course, was an Anglican priest. This is a big emphasis of his. Hence, this is from the Methodist Publishing House, right? So that's where we're getting it. Are these terms new to anybody at the table?
They aren't, but I don't still understand them.
Yeah,
They're a little tough, aren't they? So the idea is that justification is this thing that happens, like there's a chasm between you and God because of sin, and somehow the atoning death and resurrection of Jesus make you just. Like I think this is like based on this traditional understanding of like chutes and ladders, right? You're on a chute down to the dark fiery place, and justification puts you back up to the platform and closes the chute. So now you're on like even footing with God, but then sanctification is when you start to climb the ladder. Just maybe that makes sense.
because you're doing it on your own.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a sticky thing that even in the video, I don't know if you saw the tension between like, you don't sanctify yourself, but you have to sanctify yourself. Right?
Yeah.
Like this is the thing like God gives you, otherwise it's sanctimonious, not actually
Right.
sanctification. But if it's all on God, then you got nothing. Then you just, so there's like this tension, right? Like you don't get to like climb this ladder on your own. You're kind of like pulled up the ladder and you respond.
Right. Okay.
I think. Now, no, I'm not saying that's the way it is. I'm trying to say this is kind of like, I think the way we use these terms.
Now, it says in here that the Orthodox Church practices sanctification.
Yeah.
I was confused on that.
So we really struggle in the Western tradition with the word apotheosis. And I think I've mentioned it to you before. Apotheosis is the process of becoming a god. You know, don't think in terms of polytheism, but this is literally what came out of the Nicene Creed. The guy who sponsored it and promulgated, Athanasius of Alexandria, said, God became a human so that humans could become gods. So there is this understanding, not that we become demigods or like part of the pantheon, but that we get to share in eternality, which otherwise is something relegated to God only. So the incarnation is like our way. It's like sort of the mean or the justification. The incarnation is the way of us going from finitude to infinitude. And when you go from finitude to infinitude, that's apotheosis. That's like becoming more than you are, immortal, if that makes a little bit more sense. Again, I don't think we use that in the Western language. Like nobody says like, I'm going to be God when I grow up, but and no Greek person would say it quite like that. But that is this understanding is we become God-like in the sense of becoming eternal beings.
Well, okay. It says in here that Adam and Eve fell out of the Garden of Eden because they wanted to be like God. But we are now saying that we are going to become like God. We're becoming.
I'm glad you're confused about that, because actually, when you think about it, its story, Eve doesn't think, I'm going to make God really mad. I'm going to commit some heinous evil. She says, I want to be like God. This is what we tell our children in church. When you grow up, you should strive to be like Jesus, but not too much.
Right.
No, I mean, that's an interesting story, isn't it?
Yeah.
So in some ways, like they disobey God, they disobey so that they can be like God instead of being underneath God. And I would tell you, like, that actually seems like a really good idea to me. Not the disobedience part, but being like on the same plane. Like, that's how I read Jesus, you know, not being over and above. The greatest among you will be the servant of all. Who's the greatest among us? Well, God. So God is the servant of all, right? Like that seems really good to me. which is why I have to, me personally, I have to push on those stories,
Mhm.
right? Adam and Eve sinned, they were disobedient, and I have to say, like, I don't know, it didn't make sense to me. Mystic people do this stuff too, and like I know this is gonna sound really weird, but I want to share this mystic story. You know, in the Islamic tradition, they don't have the devil, they have this sort of angel called Iblis. So Iblis is like the devil figure, and really bad. Except that like some of the Sufis are like, well, maybe Iblis isn't so bad, because there's this story that hey, you're only supposed to worship God. This is very true in Islam, so much so that you can't have any images, right? God is super transcendent, doesn't have a personal name. And so in the Quran, God creates the human being, Adam, and tells all of the heavenly beings to bow down to the Adam. God says this. And they all do it except for Iblis, because Iblis will only bow down to God.
And he's Buddha,
Maybe.
according to them, though.
According to most Muslims, yes. According to these mystical people, like, no, like Iblis was the only faithful one, because the Iblis disobeyed the command from God in order to obey the greater command from God. By the way, that's what Jesus does when people say you healed on the Sabbath. He doesn't say like you don't have to honor the Sabbath. He says like there's a greater way to honor the Sabbath. That's all mystical stuff. I didn't answer any of your questions. I just made it more difficult because it's difficult, right? And we don't teach children the nuances of stories that we haven't unwound yet because we think it's too complicated. Although I would tell you, if you read a Bible story and you ask a kid, like, what does that mean? They rarely will tell you the conclusion you learned in Sunday school, unless they've been fed it, right? What I learned in Sunday school is here's the story. Eve disobeyed. Adam was a weak man. Don't be like them. So like what I carried was not only the story, but how to read the story. If you just read the story and then you say, like, what does that mean? It's sort of like, I don't know, like they were wanting to be like God. That seems like not a bad thing. So like, what is the story really about? And then what do you know? I don't have a good answer for you. And we don't like to not have good answers. And we like our kids to have good answers too. Developmentally, there's a time where they need that. And then somewhere around high school, they don't need that. They need like ambiguity.
You know, I've struggled with the Adam and Eve story also, but I got some clarification in that one line here in our book that said they sought not God's character, but his power. And that was the down. So what's the difference between the character?
I think it's the difference between knowledge and wisdom.
Well, just throw
Next
that out.
question. What's the difference between knowledge and
Well,
wisdom?
right, and so knowledge is like computational ability, and wisdom is the ability to use knowledge to support life, right? To support life. So knowledge is splitting the atom. Wisdom is not using nuclear warfare. I mean, I don't, yeah, yeah.
So if we want God's character, that's what sanctification is, right? So to be more like God, but not his power.
Yeah, I mean, so, and
To-
I get
to
that-
give us
I get that's
sanctification.
their interpretation of Eden. Like, I get that, and it could make sense. I'm not sure it's necessary that this is right. I get this thing. I mean, I do think, right, that, I mean, there's that old adage, right, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, I mean, I think the criterion is what do we use our power for? To control or to level? And this is where I think the Maundy Thursday thing becomes really important, right? Like, if I've done this terrible thing for you, you need to do this for other people. So use your power to bend down, not to make others bow before you. That seems to be God's character, which comes from a position of power.
He talks about here what's called the holiness of seclusion. So I got confused as maybe we should be secluded or we should not be secluded.
See, and this is a hard thing when you hear set apart. Holiness is being but set apart.
Yes.
Well, maybe you've heard of apartheid. That means set apart. And I mean, the Boers read their Hebrew Bible literally and decided that God had set apart the Boers from what they called the Kafirs, like the dark people, because those were the descendants of Canaan and they were meant to serve, and that's what God intended. And this is how they justified apartheid biblically, because they were being set apart and being holy, and masters should not be commingled with servants. I think they forgot to read Paul, and this is in general the case that Dutch Reformed theology is based on the Hebrew Bible and covenant more than it is on careful readings of the New Testament. I mean, that's like general, but seems to be the case, right? But I just do think it leads us into this thing, right? And we talked about this 2 or 3 weeks ago, this injunction to be in the world, but not of the world. So are Christians supposed to like cordon themselves off and live in some kind of holy quarantine and set themselves apart ritualistically, or the ways like, should we only do business with other Christian people so that we have a Christian yellow pages? That exists, by the way, right?
Yes,
As a way of saying, like, since you have the same beliefs I do, you must be a better contractor or a much more trustworthy one. I can tell you right now, I don't know if the case. Because people are people, right? I mean, we're just folk. So what does it mean to be set apart? This is what people have been trying to tease out for a long time, and sometimes we take it so literally, we didn't take it seriously, and we find ourselves purposefully saying, like, you're degenerate because you haven't been regenerated. You're unjust because you haven't been justified. How do you know if somebody's been justified? Nobody's got a good answer for that. Because you can pray the words, doesn't mean you meant them. Doesn't mean there was any conversion. I mean, this is part of the problem with sanctification. How do you know it?
And so only people who are Christians can be sanctified?
Well, I would say according to this study book, yes. We have to work that out individually, I think. What do you think about that?
Well, if we were all created by God, then somehow we all have a relationship with God. It may not be in the same tradition or the same way that we do it, but it is probably just as powerful and just as awe-inspiring for them as it is for us.
Yeah, if you don't mind me saying, I remember when we went over to the mosque or the Islamic Center, they talked about Ramadan, which starts on Saturday, and how you do give up food during the day. But that's the lesser observance of Ramadan. The deeper observance is to give up these other things that are, the Islamic word is shirk, that are like shirking who God's called you to be. Hey, that sounds just like Lent.
yes.
We often give up a thing, a token thing, knowing that really the call of Lent is to the deeper thing. But sometimes the deeper thing is elusive, so we settle for the token. I'm not putting down chocolate, but in and of itself, it won't do much. Especially if you return to it right afterward, like what did it do? If chocolate is like a reminder for you, like, hey, this is calling me to a deeper place, then it becomes a really good gateway. But if it's just the food, it was just the food. And the Muslims say that too. So like that kind of sanctification tradition of Lent exists with similar understanding between two very different faith groups, to your point.
Yeah.
I grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school. And for us, we were trained between kindergarten and ninth grade that it was not just about what you gave up. It was more, or it had to be balanced with what you were doing. If you were attending mass every morning, you get up at 7 or at 6 to be at 7 o'clock mass every single day during Lent. That was a big sacrifice. But then, I think as an adult, I think sacrifice, what does that mean exactly?
It means to make holy. And usually it means to make holy because you've given it away.
Okay.
Right? So a sacrifice is something that's holy. And this, I think, is really helpful in my own head. And I know you've heard me say this a lot of times. Sacrifices are gifts, not investments. And that's what makes them set apart. Because you've given it, it's gone, it's not yours, you have no control. You were delighted to give it and you stop there. And that is very holy, because even when I think I'm giving a gift, I often find myself saying like, oh, you're not using that the way I wanted you to, which is a revelation that it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a investment or a barter or something. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
You ever been disappointed by how somebody used your gift? That means you didn't give it away. I think, philosophically anyway.
Well, I had an experience that I'll just share this with you. You guys can tell me what you think. I went to confession, and during the confession, I forget exactly what it was I said, but the priest said something like, "You are here, kneeling in front of God, and so you don't have to talk about all the things you've done, because the fact that you're here." And I thought, wow, no priest had ever said that to me before. And that gave confession, a whole different kind of parameters, but more meaning, more. I don't know if that makes sense. Anybody's interested or
Yeah.
expert.
It was a physical manifestation of your inward need to kneel before God.
Yes,
So it was the behavior.
yes.
And that showing up was 90%.
Yeah.
It wasn't even about whether you got all the things out.
It
You
was
showed up
about
to do
showing
it.
up.
Yeah, that seems lovely to me.
Mhm.
I think the danger in sanctification is when we think about ladders up,
Mhm.
and that we might be taking steps up somewhere, which to me thinks I'm better than I was before, or I'm higher up than you. That is the kind of set apartness that I think is the unholy kind. I don't know if that makes sense. And like the language that I get is that when we think about transcending, we've got it wrong. It's about being transformed. So transcending is about going higher, yet I'm above that, instead of the above is here in me. The most sanctified person I know was absolutely flawed. I mean, he was probably selfish, but he was so comfortable in his own skin. This is the guy I told you that, like, during the bishop's prayer, he went to the food line with no remorse whatsoever. It was the most natural thing. And it's like appalling, like, geez, what bad manners, but it's also like, God, you felt so comfortable in your own skin that you could just do that. That seems very sanctified to me, if you don't mind me saying, even though, like, socially, it's like a breach of decorum. It was very authentic. I mean, that's who that guy was.
Little children are like that.
It comes
I
from a
think.
place of innocence, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And rules are helpful, and manners and decorum are helpful. I'm not like saying we should be anarchists and whatever, but it is really interesting when, like, you can be aware of, like, convention, but you can also be authentic.
Well, it's like when you're doing a homily and the little girl comes sister, that's very called sanctify. I don't know. It's just like she's there in innocence. And it seems okay.
To me, the holy parts of that are that mom allows it to
Yes.
happen,
Yes,
and that the congregation, even with their own misgivings, also allows it to happen. Those are the holy parts. The kid is the kid, right? I don't think the kid is intending to be holy, and in some ways, maybe that is to your point. It comes from just a natural state. I mean, I guess if I got distracted terribly, we'd have to deal with that, but like, if you choose to get up and meander in the service, I might wonder what you're doing, but I'm just gonna keep going. Because like, you're having your own moment. Like, why would I stop and say like, why are you getting up? That makes no sense. Right? So, like, having this freedom to pursue your needs, or like to pursue your curiosity. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I want to have my cake and eat it too, because I like people to like be quiet. But I also like very much appreciate kids like not having to do that, because I'm not sure it's developmentally appropriate when you're 2. And even when you're 5, you probably have a 10-minute attention span, and as you know, I tend to go a lot longer than that. And so the wiggles make sense to me, like they just do. This may seem off topic, but I hope it isn't. Like, again, this is like, I think, what are the markers of like God's character?
It spoke about sanctification in several different, like the Orthodox, the Roman tradition, and the other traditions. I wasn't quite sure I understood what the difference was between those 3 traditions.
What is the Anglican tradition, the Episcopal tradition? Is
I'm not convinced that we have like a singular one, to be honest.
I've never heard too much about it.
No, usually what we argue about is like where you stand in a worship service, not like what it means. I mean that. Ellen can tell you, because she's worked with 2 different priests, like that's real important to us. It was wild, isn't it? No, John Wesley actually did believe people could be perfect in this life. He believed that, and without flaw. So I think there are different, I think maybe what's helpful to do is think about what are the different models, not necessarily from different traditions, but like what perfection means. So one model of perfection is you never make a mistake. I don't see that as being viable, because like even how you judge a mistake is so subjective, right? So be perfect as God is perfect. I'm not even sure that God's perfect by that definition. And the reason I say that is that like, apparently after I'm dead for 3 days, my dog will eat me. And like God made that. It doesn't seem perfect. It seems like the dog should always miss me and like not eat me. And
He's just cleaning up the environment.
they're scavengers. But like, I think that's not our model of perfection, but it is naturally the case. Is it perfect that wolves eat sheep? I don't know. It's what God made. So like, God's not always like as gentle as we think. Or it doesn't always, like if God is behind this stuff, right? Then like God made this and called it good, which means like that's a subjective term. God finds it good. Who made cancer? God made cancer. Boy, we don't usually think cancer is very good, do we? I don't want it. You don't want it. God made it. God created everything that is, seen and unseen. We say that every week. That flies in the face of perfection is no mistakes, right? But perfection's nuance. And good news is that the Hebrew word isn't perfect, it's set apart. And set apart could mean a lot of different things, right? It could mean quarantine. It could mean, quite honestly, like some of you probably have Christmas dishes, or when you got married, you got like china that you don't use every day. You set that stuff apart for special occasions. You know why you don't use it every day? You have to wash it by hand.
Yeah.
That's why I told my mom I don't want any of it, because I'm not doing that. She's like, well, I thought this set of china for you. Give it to Emery. If it didn't go in the dishwasher, I'm not taking it, honestly. But those days are over, like those days are over. Nothing wrong with it, but there are things we set apart. Like I've got a wine fridge with some lovely wine I'd like to drink, but not on a regular day. And usually the special day comes, I'm like, yeah, I don't feel like drinking wine today. So like it sits there for a long time because I've set it apart, right? I've set it apart for some special use. And then like we're trying to figure out what that set apartness is like. Does it mean special as better than, or does it mean like, hey, like there's a way of being centered or being aware or serving or supporting joy at just the right moment? I think those are probably better models than Romans do this and Greeks do this. It's just sort of like, what's your fundamental image here? Is perfection about a garment with no stains? Is it about perfect proportions and symmetry? Is it about, again, like, we all have things in our homes that are they're really for special occasions. Obviously, like whether you're ultra Orthodox or what I would call Christian fundamentalist, there's this understanding that the world is a corrupting influence, and so we have to resist it. I don't want to say that's wrong. I actually get the psychology of that. How you resist it or how you're present in it, that seems to be the sanctifying question, right?
But if everything is created by God, then that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so and I think this comes back to, if you didn't mind me like going backward for a second, this like really weird idea that I'm putting forth to you about maybe what we call demonic is frankly us living into the shadows of our God-given manifestations, which are good, inherently good, but they can cast shadows, right? And so like, yeah, look, abusing alcohol, not great, but comes from a part of you that could be lovely. And if you cut the whole thing out, now you've done damage to your soul. So you don't want the symptoms, you don't want that, but like the place that it comes from is you. And how we sanctify that, I think sanctification in that image to me seems like casting shorter shadows and not trying to pluck off leaves from ourselves, right? Just making the shadows shorter.
Learning to manage.
Learning to manage. I mean, like, I just keep thinking about this, like the way I grew up thinking about demon possession and like, oh, like Jesus healed somebody maybe with schizophrenia and he healed them. What does that mean? They don't have schizophrenia anymore? Like, I don't want schizophrenia. I want to be really clear. But is it wrong to have it? Like, it's a hardwired neurological condition. Like,
You just have to learn how to live with it and manage the symptoms.
it casts big shadows in a society where not everybody has it. But there's nothing inherently wrong with it. I mean, Vincent van Gogh, probably schizophrenic, produced work we still celebrate today. If he'd lost his schizophrenia, would he have been able to be an artist? I don't know the answer to that. Was he tortured? I think so. But probably he was tortured because he didn't fit in. So I wonder if sanctification, instead of saying no more schizophrenia, it's, hey, how do we like live in the garden together, making sure we don't overshadow each other, right? Or like choke each other out, because we all got a little something in us.
There's a fine line between genius and madness.
Yeah.
And I've had trouble working with psychiatrists who want to label a genius part of someone as just totally crazy. I mean, where does the crazy start and the genius end?
Right.
So learning to value that quality in someone who thinks differently and so can create wonderful creative works of art. Value that and not cut it out totally like with medication that just makes them a blob.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's perspective.
The book didn't talk about this aspect of sanctification, but it, at least to me, it's like before me now is something really, really important. Because I think it defines a lot of what we consider to be holy and perfect, right? And if there's a blemish, a mental condition, a cleft palate, I think we're pretty much over cleft palates, but we got other things we worry about, right? Like how does that fit in with what we call like the goal state? I'm also not sure that, he said something like the goal of life is not to see how much you can have, but how much you can give away. I'm not sure that's the goal of life, actually. And I'm not sure, because if you, like the First Jerusalem church, if you gave away all your assets, you would be a burden to somebody else. Francis lived that way pretty comfortably, only because not everybody did it. And they had something left to give him. And I will say, like, I have family members and parishioners, and I struggle with this, is like, when am I going to say no? I could continue to give, but I will not continue to give because it will destroy me. I don't think God wants me to be destroyed in giving to somebody who will always take and ask for more. I don't, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think it's that easy to say the goal is how much you can give away.
And there's some people having been given too much is damaging to them because they haven't learned to take care of themselves.
Right.
When we continue to give and give and give, then that it's like doing something for a child who can do for them. The rule is don't do something for a child that a child can do for himself. Because if you tie a shoe forever, he won't learn how to
Tie shoes, right? Right. We get that with kids, but when people are older and we're related to them,
Our adult children are harder to say no to.
boy, they can be really hard. Yeah. I think that's I think this matters for sanctification, but I'm pushing this too much. What else came up for you all? C.S. Lewis says God wants us to die to our natural selves.
I like C.S. Lewis, but I don't like that statement. I'm not comfortable with that
Yeah.
statement.
Would you say more?
I think we need to live into our natural selves. And again, learn to manage those parts that could get out of control. I mean, our natural self is who God made.
I think a lot of that theology comes from an idea that because of original sin, we're born like somehow messed up, which I can't buy it.
Is original sin, well, as a Catholic, I was raised with original sin, but is that accurate for other? I'm not sure about what.
Yeah, I would say most mainstream Christian even if they would say they don't believe in original sin, they would say they believe in a fall,
Okay,
which means you believe in original sin. I'm just be honest. Like some people say, I'm not comfortable with that, but I believe in the fall. I mean, they're the same thing.
oh, okay, I never heard of that. I didn't know
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, that's a non-Catholic term for original sin.
Okay.
Yeah. And that shows up in the Episcopal. I mean, that shows up here a lot.
Uh-huh,
Like that's in some of our stuff. And again, like the prayer of humble access that people deeply love, right? Is we're not worthy of the gratitude that comes up under your table. We're not worthy, because why aren't we worthy? Because we're fallen. Because we've offended your holy laws, like
Okay.
these kinds of things.
Yeah.
I would say that in general, most non-Catholic people I know and I would say most Catholic people don't even believe the true doctrine, which is like, if you die before you're baptized, you're going to hell forever. And
Yeah.
most Catholic people don't believe that, even though that's official doctrine. I would say most, particularly Protestants, would say, no, like it's not till your age, like 11, that you gotta like get right with God
But then you'll die if you haven't been baptized.
and go to hell. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and it's not even baptism, it's the sinner's prayer. That's the new baptism. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's based on your faith, not the works of the church. So baptism's a work of the church, regardless of your faith. I guess you have to show up to get it, right? But
Yeah.
it's the work of the church. And in the Protestant community, it's all on you. This one work is the thing you have to do. This particular prayer and admission, and that's it. And it's individual, not communal.
So original sin. What is that?
Oh, it's this idea, remember, this is Augustine's idea, so it comes around in like the late 4th, early 5th century. It's the idea that when Adam and Eve disobeyed God in the garden, the sin of disobedience, that they were ontologically changed.
So it was the sin of disobedience.
And they pass that on biologically forever. So all of us are born with like the sin gene. And it is only through baptism that gene gets fixed. Baptism is gene therapy.
I can't remember, it was in here. I really liked, he said that original sin was, I can't remember the exact quote, or if it was original sin, but he equated original sin to Adam and Eve put their self-interest above God's interest. I thought that was a good explanation to me, is they put themselves and what they wanted above what they knew God wanted of them.
Hmm.
So have you ever heard that? I read that, I think.
I have, again, like, I get that. In the story itself, I have a hard time with it, because, like, again, like, for all we know, Eve, once she says, the story says, the fruit is appealing to the eye.
That's what she wanted,
Nothing wrong with that, though.
no?
It's good for nourishment. Seems good. And it is a source of knowledge. That all seems good. And maybe there was a better way to handle it than that. I don't know. But those intentions seem not bad to me.
Well, I guess that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because she wouldn't know anything about knowledge, because she was totally innocent. And so God put them there. He knew that they were going to do that, I guess. I don't know, it just seems like a strange story.
I think particularly with the way we've made that such a core story and defined doctrines out of it, instead of like, okay, like, yeah, like humans are curious, sometimes to their own detriment. I could live with that conclusion, right? I could live with that conclusion. But when we start pushing really hard, sort of like, wait a minute, God didn't want us to know stuff? But I thought that's why we're having Bible study. It's like God wants us to know stuff.
But it kind of, in society, you have to have rules. All societies have to have laws, rules, some kind of structure, otherwise society crumbles. So maybe, he just gave them one rule. And they broke it. Because it was what they wanted, not what he wanted. They wanted, I mean, whether or not they should have wanted it, it was a rule, a law. He asked them not to do it.
I'm always gonna ask why though, and here's why I'm gonna ask why. And maybe this is me being really liberal, so apologies in advance. The way I came up is that, same-sex couples, that can't work. And when you said like, why is that? Because God said so. Why did God say so? Because God said so.
But he didn't say that.
Well, in Leviticus, if a man lays with a man as with a woman, they shall both be stoned to death.
But who said that? Wasn't God? Jesus didn't say that.
So, but you see where we start to get sticky, and
Yeah.
I will tell you, this is like, in my own spiritual development, I don't like hearing that God said something just to say it, and there's no reason behind it. And you could say like, well, you may not understand God's reasoning, you just have to do it. I don't find that compelling still. Like, I need to know, because like reasonably, what's sacramental about my marriage has nothing to do with the ability for one of us to get pregnant. Like, if we were both barren or had our tubes tied and vasectomies, I don't think anybody in the room would say that's not a good marriage. You'd say like, so what? Right? Marriage isn't about the ability to have children. So if that's the case, then why do I need a womb involved at all? Seems like I need consent and vows and commitments to be followed. I mean, that's what's sacramental about my marriage is not like we have different genitals, but that like we're committed to each other. Well, I think, and so I don't think that God does indeed prohibit homosexuality, but I had to get there reasonably because the church that raised me said God did categorically, period, dot, done. Right? So God said not to do it. Doesn't matter the reason, don't do it. I can't, that doesn't have traction for me because too many things were used abusively with that. I don't know if that makes sense. Women in ministry, like I just started out, like, again, Lottie Moon, you're still collecting in her name, and she was a woman pastor. I just find that so ironic. I mean, it's so ironic. What's the rule? Well, because God said women can't be ministers. Why? Well, that's just the way it is. Well, no, and God didn't say that. And it's like, this is what we do with scripture stuff, right? And when we turn the Bible into an instruction book instead of a conversation partner, I think we get in trouble. And that's why I either think with the Garden of Eden, I think there's a lot of conversations that can go really great places. But if we turn it to an instruction book, conversation's overdone, obey, do what you're told. Right? I mean, and I don't hear you saying that. What I hear is like, that's the thing I think that's important to resist as a mark of sanctified life. I think it's pretty sanctified to listen to an alternative viewpoint with empathy and interest, even if you don't adopt it. I think that's a mark of sanctification.
And maturity,
And
which
maturity.
is supposedly the same thing.
Yeah,
We're
God's
mature.
character. Yeah. Wesley says you're justified in a moment, but you're sanctified over the course of your life. Of course, he's a church guy. I
I think
mean,
that was one of their skills. They said things so beautifully.
oh, and really, they wouldn't have done well if it weren't for Charles, right? He was the hymn writer. And he knew how to put on some nice tunes. We sang one the other day, right? Was that 4,000 tongues to sing? That's Charles Wesley song. Yeah. Both very poetic. But I'm not sure I agree with them though. I mean, maybe you are justified in a moment. But maybe that moment happened before you even knew it did. The concept is hard for me because it presumes there's a chasm between you and God that has to be mended. I'm not sure that chasm's real. I think it's an imagined chasm. And maybe justification is the word I use that helps me realize the chasm is closed. But if I'm real honest, like there never was a chasm. I feel a chasm, but if God's omnipresent, then
There
there's
is no
not one.
chasm.
Maybe the moment is the moment at which you were aware that there is no chasm.
That's what I think. I think the language describes our feeling or our experience, but in terms of truth language, I mean, the Psalms even say, where can I go to escape your presence? If I go to Sheol, you're there. If I go to heaven, you're there. If I get the wings of the morning and fly away, like you're there. I mean, that's in scripture.
That's being one with.
I think it's being one with and sort of saying, I'm not going to run away from you anymore because it's futile. I can't, like I give up. You're gonna be with me wherever I go, even if I make it awful. So
Does it seem fair, or is it, I may be way off, that it's really up, each one of us decides whether there's a chasm there or not?
I think the whole chasm language, I think really is just like about our perception. And so, yeah, I think probably it is up to our individual perception, but not up to actual like truth.
Right,
Truthfully, there's no chasm. We may perceive there is. And then the healing work of justification and sanctification is to realize there was no chasm.
right.
There doesn't need to be one. Like God's in this with me. And so like for me, and this is what C.S. Lewis does. He says, you may not always know where God is, but since joy comes from God, just follow joy. He didn't say follow fun or follow dopamine, follow joy. It makes us Puritans a little like uncomfortable, because in the Puritan tradition, if somebody else is having fun, you need to be really concerned. They're probably doing something wrong. But fun and joy are different things, right? And to me, like maybe sanctification is about enjoying your life more. By which I don't mean having a gold-plated doghouse like Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I'm not sure that's a criterion for enjoyment. But enjoying your life, instead of funning your life, enjoying your life, if joy comes from God, that seems to be sanctified. Being content, as Paul says, under all circumstances, whether you're beat or you get the promotion you wanted. I mean, yeah, those are disappointments, but can you like have the sense of peace in those moments? That seems to be about sanctification. It makes me think that the bigger block of sanctification is not moral transgression, it's anxiety.
Hmm.
I'm not a psychologist, but we have one at the table.
This one would agree.
Can other religions, say Buddhist or Hindu, be sanctified?
Well, I mean, I think you said yes earlier, and I think I would, if for me, if God's universal, right, and this is really about being transformed and being increasingly present, yeah, I mean, it seems like people should be able to do that. So I've met people that are better people than I am, and they weren't Christian. Now, how did I really know they were better? They just had like this aura. I'm not like a believer in auras. Like I don't visualize that stuff, but like you get vibes from people sometimes. Boy, like I've met people who have like just really lovely vibes, and they weren't Christian.
When we were in with the Muslims, was that Muslims? I wound up spending most of the time with two little girls. Well, I may have already told this already, but they I just stuck with them. They told me where to take the shoes. They kind of explained things to me. Then they took me to a little room to sit and listen to the singing that was going on in the next room. And it's just really ingrained in my head. I knew nothing about Muslims, and these two little girls sort of introduced the whole thing, and it was in a very, in a childlike way.
Yeah.
It was so beautiful.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that.
There's something nice about dropping artifice, even when you're introducing custom and convention. To
Uh-huh,
do it without artifice
yes,
feels very like sanctified.
yeah. And I felt good about myself in that I allowed myself I just opened up to, to having this little girl pretty much take me by the hand and lead me around.
Yeah, it's funny because like the church that raised me told me, don't open yourself up to people who have bad theology, who are Muslims or Catholics or, Jewish people or whatever, because they may convert you from the one true faith. And I would just suggest, like, maybe a different way of being set apart is being open. How many people are open that you know? I know people who are open in some areas and closed in others. I mean, that's probably where most of us are, but to think about being increasingly open, I don't know. I think I'd rather be that than the other thing.
It's risky.
Yeah, because they might change your mind, but like, God, I hope so. When I'm thinking well.
Can a person be a person of different faiths at the same time?
There's a really great book about this called The Life of Pi. I don't know if you've read it. The first 75 pages tackle that question, because on one day he goes to the mosque, and another day he goes to the church, and another day he goes to the Hindu temple, and he really likes them all. And then the priest and the imam and the guru fight out about which one he belongs to, and he's like, "But like, I can't do all of it." It's an interesting question that we say set apart means hard border, not like home base. So I don't know the answer to that. You're asking the wrong guy, because like I clearly flirt with other religious traditions that seem very valuable and thoughtful to me. Like I don't know how not to do that. I actually kind of consider it a strength, although like not everybody does. So I don't know what to say.
In the Episcopal Church, we have a thing called Education for Ministry. And it really, being a new Episcopalian, when I started that course, really opened my eyes to, I think the whole premise of it is to study and form your own opinion. It brings in a lot of different religions and ideas and teaches you about them without any bias of saying, but we believe like this. And I found that a remarkable 4-year study and learned a lot from it. And it really has inspired me to go on and dig deeper and study more and buy a lot of books about different things. So if you look at my library at home, you go, what are you?
Yeah.
But it was amazing to me to feel like I was now part of something that was so open to other values and beliefs. And it's like, learn about it and form your own opinion. So I really recommend that.
I agree with Kay. I really do. My answer to Tim would have been, of course, because my religion, even though I attend the Episcopal Church and very supportive of the community, my true faith is very individual and very personal, and that's built from a lot of different traditions to form my relationship. My relationship with God is not Episcopal. universal. But I choose to participate in this tradition
Mhm.
because it has meaning to me.
The support
And-
group.
Hmm.
It's a support group.
It's a support group and,
Very
the
accepting.
rituals, the traditions have meaning for me. But some of that meaning is built from other faiths too, so. Yes, my answer would be yes,
Yeah.
a resounding yes.
Yes, me too.
Tim and I, and many of you here probably have done the same thing, traveled extensively. So when you go to different countries, we've made it a practice to attend a religious event or do something that where we better understand if there was something different about a religion in that country or in that area. And it's always been a rewarding experience, always something that you learn from, that yeah, God is everywhere.
Yeah.
God is everywhere.
Well, and there's this interesting bit that I think is again like a different image of sanctification, the one I grew up with. It shows up in Corinthians 3, where he says, "Don't you know that you are a temple for the Holy Spirit?"
Mhm.
And the way it reads in English, "you are," it's like second person singular. You or you. But in Greek, it's second person plural. Don't you know that you all are a temple for the Holy Spirit? I'm sure there were people who heard that letter who were mediocre Christians or didn't believe the right stuff. They probably didn't genuflect before they sat down in the pew, or they didn't cross themselves at the right time. I'm sure there were people in the group like that, and they were part of the temple for the Holy Spirit. And so maybe sanctification is, instead of setting apart like you don't belong, we're set apart by our ability to incorporate things that seem really hard to incorporate.
Some of those things like blessing, again, having been raised as Catholic, blessing yourself or kneeling before you go into a pew becomes something that you just have done since you were 3. And so no matter what church you go to, you tend to lean towards wanting to do that.
Yeah.
And then somebody says, we don't do that in this church. And then you go, oh, but I'll do.
But
Yeah,
I do.
I need
Yeah.
to, I need to think more like, no, but I do it. And it's just respect or don't even have to explain anything.
You're
But
right.
I
Yeah,
do.
You do.
isn't it funny? I mean, I think this is an interesting, I love that you introduced this, because more often than not, when we see somebody's doing something we don't do, it's like, we don't do that, instead of, can you tell me what that means to
What
you?
that means, yeah.
I don't care what it means to you, we don't do it here.
Yeah.
Bye.
But I mean, I think that's probably in general, like the way we do culture, and maybe a way of being set apart is, instead of, we don't do that here, can you tell me why you do that? Because I want to not justify yourself, I'm curious. I don't know what it means to you.
We had a visitor at the church years ago when I was new, and also not knowing why we were doing things. And it came to a part of the service, I can't remember. Some people stood and some people no. And she turned around with this look of horror. And I said, your choice. You know?
Yeah.
Little did you know, I don't know.
Well, actually, I've had people ask me, Clint, what to do, kneel, and I'm not gonna do that. No. I get in some ways it can be disorienting, but then when it's normalized and you can't do it, or you won't do it, you don't fit in, and I don't want to normalize that. I get the comfort of the instruction. I get that. But I also worry about, I took communion to a lady in the hospital. And I asked her if she wanted to have communion. She said, I can't have it. I can't kneel. I said, honey,
Dear.
Oh.
honey, it's all about kneeling in your heart, not your body. I mean, I had to talk her into receiving the Eucharist, which she desperately wanted. But at the age of 86, she'd never received it supine.
Oh, wow.
And I had to convince her that it would be okay. I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did, but that's why I'm afraid of printing rubrics. Yeah,
Well, what I like that you say is kneel or stand as you are able. I like that because I have become at the time in my life when there's certain things I can't do physically,
right.
but I don't feel like I'm less worthy.
Well, because you aren't. And that's the scary part, I think, when we become so set apart
Mhm,
that we confuse being set apart with rigidity
mhm.
instead of like intention and yeah.
And I like that very much that you say that,
Thank
as
you.
you are able, that just relaxes you about it.
I hope so. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
It's the first time he heard, yeah, I heard him say that. It was
Yeah.
like, all right,
We've got to go see a
he's
doctor,
got a
but,
doctor's appointment.
a few years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we were in Uganda and we were hiking, and I was, in the Rocky Mountain Gorillas. And I just got a little note that the Uganda Parliament just passed a law that says anyone that's gay will get life imprisonment.
Oh, my gosh. In Uganda?
So you're imprisoned either way. Yeah, in a cell or in a community.
That's very, very, very sad. Because when I sat across, I was there for about 40 minutes. I was closer to the gorilla than you and I are right now. And I sat there for about 35, 40 minutes. And there was a connection there. I never felt anything like that before.
And he hiked, it was a difficult hike. I couldn't go because I had a bad knee, but he hiked the whole distance and the whole time that he came back, he was like walking on air with this
Yeah.
experience I had with this gorilla.
And it's the funny thing, isn't it, that we can, in some ways, be so cognizant of that, and in other ways, be so closed off.
Yeah,
For me, that was a holy moment.
Yeah.
oh, yeah, it was.
It's certainly part of God's world.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a spiritual director say that we often, like and I think this is about sanctification, there's moments where we feel like we're being broken apart. But really God's intention is that we would be broken open. And we confuse the two often. And I don't know that I necessarily like the word break, but the idea that God wants us to open, we can sometimes feel like we're going to lose everything, when really it's how we gain everything. And I think that some of this set apart, like it leads to apartheid, is that will break me apart, so I'm gonna close. Instead of, oh, like maybe this is a chance to be like cracked open more. It's not always clear when it's which. It's not. And I think that's like, maybe that's what he's trying to say about it comes from God, right? Like, because I don't always know when it's which. I don't.
Is that like getting overwhelmed? Is that being broken open? I got overwhelmed this morning and I was going,
Yeah,
this
no,
one,
I
this
think
one.
those are different things. I mean, I will say, like, sometimes being overwhelmed can presage being broken open, but I would say being overwhelmed can also break you apart. And I don't think God's interested in breaking us apart. And there are burdens in the life that will break you apart. That's real. Like, and I don't think like, oh, here's another opportunity for you to be broken open, thank God. No, but I would say retrospectively, probably everything is an opportunity to be broken open, I think.
I think maybe the things that we did visiting the other faiths
was a real breaking open for me, because I didn't know, I didn't have extreme prejudice, but I think some of us who were there had misunderstandings about those faith practices. And it was a revelation to me, and I felt something like sanctification because I understood and I connected with the beauty of each of those faith practices. Like the imam inviting us to participate in their prayers, instead of like, you can watch this, but you can't do it because you don't understand what it's about. So, I mean, this was to me, well, it was a growth for me. And I want to think maybe it was a part of further sanctifying my spirit. It meant a great deal to me to have done that. Yeah, really.
I know I share this every year, but because there's another math person at the table who hasn't heard it, I do want to share. This is the Orthodox view of sanctification, which is that we are in an equilateral triangle. So like who you are right now, this moment, is sort of the middle here, and you're equidistant from the self that God made you to be, like your true self, from God and from others. And a distorted view of sanctification says, I can get closer to God by distancing myself from my neighbor. The Orthodox view says, if you move closer to God, you have necessarily moved closer to your true self and your neighbor. Or conversely, if you move closer to your neighbor, you just move closer to God. So really what happens is this equilateral triangle, either it dilates or contracts, right? Either way, but always an equilateral relationship. So you can't say like, I hate myself and get closer to God. That actually won't work. And that's a really old idea, but I think it's actually pretty psychologically verified. I mean, this is, I think, how most psychologists think too. Like, hey, if you hate yourself, you can't really love anybody, right? I mean, and so it makes me wonder about this grid of sanctification and how we track it. I was talking to somebody yesterday who's been having these kind of like mystical visions of God, right? And those are really lovely things, but the real proof always in mysticism has been, do you love your neighbor more when you come back? And if you don't, it was a bad vision. I mean, that's from mystic tradition itself. The touchstone is, do you love the world and your neighbor more after that ecstatic experience with God, or do you despise the world more? And if it's you despise more, it wasn't real. So when we talk about the other, are we just talking about other Christians or our neighbors, or are we talking about people with schizophrenia? And I know this was a sticking point earlier, but like, what about Joseph Stalin? Pol Pot? Well, they're not human beings. So when we do that, with this logic, the triangle just got bigger. Right? Like, you're not worthy of my love. I'm going to distance myself from you. That makes me distant from God too. I'm going to mortify my flesh. My body's no good. I'm going to get away from that so I can be closer to God. Whoops, God, where did you go? It's a simple diagram, but it's really complicated to live into, isn't it?
Explain it again.
Yeah, so it says, here's the self God made you to be, and you're not that person. Exactly. Like, you've got barriers to love you've erected over time and this and that. Here's God, and here's other folk. So here's where we're living right now, in the midst of our brokenness and our light, some distance from who God had in mind for us to be, some distance from others, some distance from God. The Orthodox view says, hey, the closer you get to God through piety and worship and service, you will naturally also get closer to the self God made you to be. And when you do that, you'll also be closer to other people. Like they say, these three distances are always congruent. All the angles are congruent too, so there's no skewing this triangle, like it's equilateral or nothing.
What's the name of the triangle? I mean, what's the name of that symbol? I wanna look it up.
I don't know.
Mike's drawing.
Mike's drawing, yeah, I know, I don't know.
Finding it
I don't
online.
know. I hate to say this, it's like one of those terrible things I should be better at. I totally forgot the source for that, but it's like 20 years old that I read that, whatever.
That's okay, I always want to look things up.
I think it's right though, and I do think it's right.
It makes great sense. Except the closer you get to your own, it looks like the further you get from God, but you're saying it expands.
Yeah, it dilates
Yeah, darling.
as an equidistant, right? So like, really the goal of glorification is that there is no distance from any of the vertices. The triangle is a point where God and you and your neighbor are all right there.
Equal, distance, okay. That's really fascinating. Find it, Sandra.
Yeah, I'll look it up when I go home.
I'd like to know if you find it.
Right.
Well, thanks, everybody. So we'll do